In the winter of 1871, 600 United States soldiers marched into the southern plains of Texas to crush the last free Comanche bands. They had rifles, supply wagons, wool blankets, and military rations. They had every advantage a modern army could carry into the field. Within weeks, the cold started killing them. Frostbitten fingers, horses collapsing in snowdrifts, men huddling around fires that burned through their firewood faster than they could haul it across the empty grassland. And somewhere out on that same frozen prairie, the people they were hunting were sleeping through the night without a single log of firewood. The Comanche had been doing it for over 150 years. What nobody knew at the time was that the Comanche were not simply enduring the winter. They had built a survival system so complete that every piece of it came from one animal and one landscape, and the whole thing worked together like a machine. The soldiers were trying to survive. The Comanche had already solved survival generations ago. This is the story of how they did it. 170 years before those soldiers ever set foot on the plains, the Comanche were not plains people at all. They were mountain dwellers, a branch of the northern Shoshone, living in the high country of what is now Wyoming and Montana. Their language came from the same Uto-Aztecan family as their Shoshone relatives. They hunted on foot, gathered what the mountains gave them, and lived more or less the way their ancestors had lived for centuries. Then the horse arrived. Spanish colonists had brought horses to the southwest in the 1500s, and by the late 1600s, those horses had spread north through trade and raids. The Comanche got hold of them sometime around 1700, likely through their Ute allies who had been experimenting with horses since the middle of the 17th century, and everything changed. Within a single generation, they went from a small mountain band to one of the most mobile and feared peoples on the continent. They migrated south, off the mountains and onto the vast grasslands of the southern plains. They drove the Apache out of the territory, fighting them off so decisively that the Apache retreated to the edges of the region and never recovered their former position on the plains. The Comanche then claimed a domain that would eventually span 240,000 square miles, from the Arkansas River in the north to the Edwards Plateau in the south. The Spanish called it Comancheria. The Comanche simply called themselves Numunu, the people. And for more than a century, both the French and the Spanish sought Comanche friendship because anyone who tried to cross Comancheria without permission from the Comanche did so at their own risk. For a decade after every other nation on the southern plains had submitted to the United States government, the Comanche still lived free. But freedom on the southern plains came with a price, and the price was winter. The heart of Comancheria sat on the Llano Estacado, the staked plains of West Texas. The Spanish explorer Coronado described the land in a letter to the King of Spain in 1541, writing that after traveling over 300 leagues across it, there were no more landmarks than if they had been swallowed up by the sea. It was flat, featureless, and almost completely treeless, a tableland larger than all of New England, rising in places to more than 5,000 feet. In summer, the heat could crack the earth. In winter, Arctic winds screamed down from the Rockies with nothing to stop them. Temperatures dropped well below zero, blizzards buried the grass, and there was almost no wood to burn. For European armies and settlers, this was a death sentence. You could not build a cabin without timber. You could not keep a fire going without fuel. You could not stay warm without shelter. The Llano Estacado was, in the words of one historian, a place of extreme desolation where white men became lost and disoriented and died of thirst. The Comanche lived there for 150 years, and they did not just survive, they thrived. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because the Comanche answer to winter ran on 5 interlocking parts, and if you removed any single one, the rest would have collapsed. The first piece was knowing where to go when the cold came. The Comanche did not try to gut it out on the open plains in January. They moved. Every autumn, as the days shortened and the first cold fronts pushed south, Comanche bands packed their tipis onto horse-drawn travois and migrated to winter camps in the deep canyons that cut through the Llano Estacado. These were places where the geography itself became a weapon against the cold. The most important of these was Palo Duro Canyon, the second largest canyon on the North American continent, stretching roughly 60 miles long with walls rising 800 feet above the floor. The canyon cuts through the otherwise pancake-flat Texas panhandle like a hidden world. From the rim, you would never know it was there. Those 800-foot walls did two things. They blocked the brutal northern winds that swept across the open prairie, and they trapped warmth radiating off the canyon floor and walls during the day. Inside Palo Duro, temperatures could run 15 to 20 degrees warmer than on the exposed plains above. The canyon also held permanent water sources, streams and springs that ran year-round. It had timber, cottonwood, and mesquite and juniper along the creek beds. And it drew wildlife. Deer, antelope, and buffalo sheltered there too, driven into the canyon by the same cold that drove the Comanche. The Spanish had even named the place for what grew there. Palo Duro means hardwood in Spanish, a reference to the tough mesquite and juniper that lined the canyon floor. On the treeless plains above, firewood was almost impossible to find. Inside the canyon, it grew along every creek bed. Multiple Comanche bands would camp inside the canyon simultaneously, and the defensible position, with sheer walls on every side, meant they could do so with less risk of surprise attack. Someone in the 1950s could have called this a geographic advantage and left it there, but that would miss what they built inside the canyon. The Comanche tipi looked like a tent to outsiders. To the people who built them, it was an engineered shelter designed for extreme cold, refined over centuries by families whose lives depended on getting it right. A single tipi required 13 to 16 buffalo hides, each one scraped, tanned by hand, and sewn together into a semicircular cover. This cover was stretched over a frame of 16 to 18 lodgepoles, typically lodgepole pine or cedar, arranged in a cone and lashed together near the top. The cone shape served a purpose beyond tradition. It deflected wind. A flat wall catches wind like a sail and gets knocked down. A cone lets wind slide past. In a plains blizzard, with gusts strong enough to flip a wagon, that difference meant the structure stayed standing while anything square would have been torn apart. At the center of the earthen floor, a fire pit was dug a few inches deep. Above it, two adjustable smoke flaps at the apex of the cone could be opened or closed using exterior poles. This let the Comanche control the draft precisely, venting smoke upward and out while keeping heat trapped inside. In winter, they added a second layer. An interior lining of additional hides hung from the poles a few inches inside the outer wall. This created a pocket of dead air between the two layers, the same principle behind modern double-pane windows and insulated walls. Cold air hitting the outer wall could not penetrate the gap to reach the living space inside. With a small fire burning and a family inside radiating body heat, a winter tipi stayed warm enough to sleep comfortably even when the temperature outside dropped well below freezing. The door, also made of hide, faced east toward the rising sun by default, catching morning warmth. When a storm came from a different direction, they simply repositioned the opening to block the wind. I mean, think about that for a second. This was portable, windproof, insulated, ventilated housing that could be assembled in under an hour by the women of the household and packed back onto a travois the next morning. Try designing that from scratch with nothing but animal hides and wooden poles. The fire inside the tipi leads directly to the next question. Where did the fuel come from when there were no trees? The answer was under their feet. Millions of buffalo roamed Comancheria, and those millions of buffalo left behind millions of dried dung patties, known universally across the plains as buffalo chips. When dried in the sun for a few weeks, buffalo chips were clean to handle, nearly odorless, and burned with little visible flame but produced hot, long-lasting coals. Settlers who arrived later would adopt the practice and start calling them plains oak. In 1886, a zoologist named William Hornaday, who had studied the buffalo extensively, wrote that when over 1 year old and thoroughly dry, this material makes excellent fuel. Buffalo chips had advantages over wood that actually made them preferable for life on the plains. They did not throw sparks the way dry timber does, which mattered enormously on a landscape where a single spark could ignite the bone-dry prairie grass and start a wildfire that burned for miles. They smoldered rather than blazed, producing steady, even heat that was safer inside a tipi than an open flame. And the supply was, for the time being, essentially limitless. The Comanche did not need to chop down a tree and split it. They walked across the prairie and picked up what the buffalo had already produced. And somehow, it gets worse for anyone who thought this was primitive, because the fuel was just one layer. The same animal gave them heat, shelter, food, and clothing, all at once. Buffalo robes were the Comanche winter coat. Thick hides, cured with the fur left on and worn fur side in against the skin, they trapped body heat and blocked wind the way modern down insulation is designed to. In the worst cold, a buffalo robe wrapped around the body kept a person warm enough to walk, ride, or sleep outside. Comanche women wore fringed buckskin skirts and poncho-style blouses, adding leggings and a heavy robe in winter. Men wore buckskin breechcloths, leggings, and shirts, layering the robe on top. Their moccasins were built from the toughest section of the buffalo hide, the area near the neck where the skin was thickest and most resistant to puncture. Then, they applied animal grease to the exterior, creating a waterproof barrier. Wet feet in sub-zero temperatures cause frostbite faster than almost anything else, and the Comanche solved that problem with rendered fat and buffalo leather. You would think someone would have said something about the elegance of all this. Nobody did, because the people watching were too busy trying not to freeze. The clothing did more than keep a person warm. Every layer was built around an understanding of exactly how cold kills. The most dangerous situation in winter is not standing in cold air. It is standing in cold air with wet skin. Moisture pulls heat away from the body roughly 25 times faster than dry air does. That is why frostbite starts at the extremities, the fingers, the toes, the ears, where moisture from sweat or snow contact meets the cold first. The Comanche built their winter gear around keeping the body dry at every point. The buffalo robe kept the torso warm and dry. The moccasins kept the feet dry with their greased hide exterior. The leggings bridged the gap between the two. It was layered insulation from the ground up, and every layer came from the same animal. The food system was equally thorough. Buffalo meat was eaten fresh when possible, roasted or boiled over the buffalo chip fire. What could not be consumed immediately was preserved in two ways. First, the Comanche sliced meat thin and dried it in the sun on racks, sometimes smoking it over low flames for additional shelf life, producing jerky that could be stored and chewed on the trail. Second, and more importantly for winter survival, they made pemmican. Pemmican was the original survival food, and the process behind it was precise. The process started with dried buffalo meat, which was pounded nearly to powder using stone tools. This powder was then mixed in roughly equal parts with rendered buffalo fat, the kind that had been slowly cooked with water to separate out the impurities and produce clean tallow that would not go rancid. Sometimes dried berries like choka cherries or blueberries were folded in. The mixture was packed hot into rawhide bags, where it cooled and hardened into a dense, waxy block. The result could last for months without refrigeration, and some sources say it could keep for years if stored properly. It could be eaten cold on the trail, sliced off in chunks and chewed slowly, or it could be broken up and cooked into a stew in camp. A single buffalo could yield roughly 100 pounds of pemmican, enough to sustain a small family for weeks in the worst part of winter, when fresh hunting was difficult or impossible. The Comanche also relied on a staple mixture of buffalo marrow and mesquite beans, a calorie-dense combination of fat, protein, and carbohydrates that required no cooking to eat. And they traded surplus pemmican and buffalo robes with neighboring tribes, the Wichita and Caddo to the east, the Pueblo peoples to the west, for goods like pumpkin seeds, honey, tobacco, and manufactured items they did not produce themselves. The Comanche tongue, the buffalo jerky, and the rendered tallow were all prized trade goods, and pemmican traveled well enough to move across hundreds of miles of trading networks. If the Comanche had stopped there, with the canyon camps, the tipi engineering, the buffalo chip fuel, the pemmican, and the robes, they would have had a solid winter survival strategy. But there was one more element that held the entire system together, and without it, none of the rest would have functioned: the horse. Horses meant something different to the Comanche than cattle meant to a rancher. To the Comanche, horses were wealth, military hardware, transportation, and the engine of the entire economy, all in one. A Comanche warrior's herd size defined his social standing. One Comanche man told an anthropologist in the 1930s that some men loved their horses more than they loved their wives. Children learned to ride before the age of 6. Warriors trained specific horses for hunting, for battle, and for racing. A favorite mount might serve all three purposes. The Comanche were, by nearly every historical account, the finest horsemen on the continent, able to fire arrows at a full gallop or hang off the side of a horse in battle, using the animal's body as a shield. For winter survival specifically, the horse was the piece that connected everything else. It was the horse that allowed the Comanche to follow buffalo herds across hundreds of miles. It was the horse that carried the Tipi poles and the rolled buffalo hides from summer camp to the canyon floor each autumn. It was the horse that hauled the rawhide bags of pemmican and the bundles of dried meat. Without horses, the Comanche would have been mountain foragers on foot, carrying everything on their backs, unable to range far enough to gather the supplies they needed. With horses, they controlled 240,000 square miles, and their geography gave them a breeding advantage no northern tribe could match. On the northern plains, winters were so cold that foals born in spring sometimes froze before they were strong enough to survive. Entire herds could be killed by a single blizzard. On the central plains, just north of Comancheria, winter blizzards could sometimes freeze whole herds where they stood. But Comancheria sat far enough south that the cold, while serious, did not prevent year-round horse breeding. Comanche herds grew enormous. Some bands maintained thousands of animals. This abundance gave them a permanent supply of mounts for every purpose, while northern tribes had to constantly raid or trade for replacements. The Comanche understood this advantage and used it deliberately. By providing horses to the peoples of the northern plains who traded with British Canada, the Comanche also secured access to British markets and British guns. They positioned themselves at the center of a continental trade network, and the horse was the currency that made it run. A Comanche chief named Sanako once refused to sell his favorite horse to an American official, explaining that trading the animal would prove a calamity to his whole band. He meant it literally. Losing that horse would have crippled his band's ability to function. If you're finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. While all of this was happening at the level of individual families and bands, the Comanche were also plugged into a larger economic network that most people never hear about. The winter canyons doubled as trade centers. Palo Duro Canyon, with its reliable water and defensible walls, served as neutral ground where multiple tribes could camp simultaneously with less risk of ambush. The Comancheros, Mexican traders who operated outside the official blessing of Spanish and later Mexican authorities, traveled to these canyon camps to exchange metal tools, weapons, cloth, and manufactured goods for buffalo robes, dried meat, horses, and other Comanche products. This trade network meant the Comanche did not need to manufacture everything themselves. They specialized in what the plains gave them, buffalo products and horses above all, and traded for everything else. It was an economy built on mobility, surplus, and geographic advantage, and it ran for over 150 years. So why could the settlers and soldiers not replicate any of this? The answer is that the Comanche system worked as a web, and you could not copy one strand of it and expect the rest to follow. It only functioned if you understood the land, the buffalo, the horse, and the seasons the way the Comanche did, as a single interconnected thing. European settlers showed up with fixed ideas about how survival was supposed to work. You built a permanent house. You cleared farmland. You hauled in supplies from somewhere else. You stayed in one place. Every one of those assumptions was wrong on the Llano Estacado. There was no timber to build with. There was no soil worth farming in that arid shortgrass country. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of featureless grassland where the terrain offered no landmarks and a wrong turn meant death by thirst. Coronado himself, with an entire Spanish expedition behind him, had gotten lost on the Llano Estacado and nearly did not make it back. Staying put on the open plains in winter, in a fixed position without canyon walls or a mobile shelter system, was a death sentence. The United States Army learned this lesson repeatedly. In 1864, Kit Carson led a large force of federal troops from Santa Fe and attacked a Comanche band at a trading post called Adobe Walls, north of what is now Amarillo. The soldiers fought and then retreated, badly outnumbered by warriors who materialized from the canyons and the open grassland as if the earth itself produced them. Later expeditions onto the Llano Estacado came back with frostbitten soldiers, dead horses, and nothing to show for it. The Comanche, meanwhile, were already on the canyon floor with their tipis up, their pemmican stored, and their herds grazing cottonwood bark in the shelter of the walls. That pattern, the Army failing to fight the Comanche head-on in open country, went on for decades, until someone in the military finally saw the weakness that no amount of winter toughness could fix. You could not beat the Comanche by chasing them across the plains. You had to destroy the system itself. The proof of that idea came not in a battle but in an attack on a winter camp. On September 28, 1874, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie led roughly 400 troopers of the 4th Cavalry, guided by Tonkawa scouts who had been nearly wiped out by the Comanche and wanted revenge, on a night march to the rim of Palo Duro Canyon. At dawn, they descended the sheer canyon walls and attacked 5 Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne villages camped along the canyon floor. The warriors put up fierce resistance while their women and children escaped up the canyon. Only 3 warriors were killed in the actual fighting. But Mackenzie had come for something more important than casualties. He had come for the system. His soldiers burned hundreds of lodges, the teepee covers, and the poles alike. They destroyed thousands of pounds of dried buffalo meat and stored pemmican, the food that would have kept those bands alive through winter. And then they rounded up over 1,400 horses. Mackenzie allowed his Tonkawa scouts to select a few animals for themselves. The rest he ordered driven 20 miles south into Tule Canyon. There, cavalrymen shot them. The finest horsemen on the continent were now on foot, without shelter, without food, with winter coming. The bands that escaped Palo Duro could not survive the approaching cold without their horses, their tipis, or their stored food. Without horses, they could not hunt. Without tipis, they could not shelter. Without pemmican, they could not eat. By November of 1874, most had surrendered and walked to the Fort Sill Reservation in present-day Oklahoma. The Quahada Comanche, the last free band, led by a young war chief named Quanah Parker, held out on the open staked plains longer than anyone else. But by 1875, even they came in. The survival system that had kept the Comanche alive and dominant for over 150 years was not overcome by a superior one. It was disassembled, one piece at a time, with mechanical efficiency. The Army killed the horses. American buffalo hunters, protected and supplied by Army soldiers, moved into Comancheria and slaughtered the herds with industrial-scale efficiency, shooting buffalo by the thousands for their hides alone and leaving the carcasses to rot on the grass. The herds that had once numbered in the millions, the herds that Comancheria's dense shortgrass could support by the millions, were virtually gone from the southern plains by the fall of 1874. The Army understood exactly what it was doing. The buffalo was the foundation of everything. Without the buffalo, there were no hides for tipis, no chips for fuel, no meat for pemmican, no robes for warmth. Without the horses, there was no way to move, to hunt, to trade, or to reach the winter canyons before the first blizzard hit. Every piece of the system depended on every other piece. Pull one out, and the rest fell apart. In 1871, those 600 soldiers had marched onto the plains and nearly froze despite their supply wagons and their wool blankets. The Comanche, sleeping in buffalo hide tipis on the floor of Palo Duro Canyon, warmed by buffalo chip fires, fed on pemmican made from the same animal that gave them shelter and fuel, wrapped in robes from the same herd that gave them everything else, had been fine. They had always been fine. The real question was never how the Comanche survived the winter. They answered that a long time ago. The question worth sitting with is why it took everyone else so long to see they were looking at a masterpiece of engineering and not a primitive way of life.